What? There's like a whole YouTube channel based around kids telling Bible stories and then adults acting it out. So if you're ever bored and want to learn the Sunday school version of Sunday school stories, that is the YouTube channel to check out. So David versus Goliath. Today we are continuing our series, Unlikely Heroes. And last week we talked about Gideon, the youngest of the weakest tribe, hiding in a wine press, and the Midianites. And God calls him the mighty man of valor and calls him out of this situation. And he's raised up in order to help the Israelites with the Midianites. And we came away with a couple things. The first one is that these unlikely heroes have a relationship with God. You got to start there. If you want to be used by God in some way, it's not a trick question. You need to know who he is. You got to have a relationship. You got to have a real encounter to be called into being unlikely and to be used as a hero in that way. And the second thing that we talked about was that ultimately the hero of the story isn't Gideon. And ultimately the hero of all of these stories we're going to look at is God. And Gideon showed God's glory. Remember, he faces the Midianites, and he's got like 35,000 men, and God says, anyone who's scared, go home. And then he's got like 20,000, and then God says, I still think maybe you'll take credit for this. So let's have you and 300. And he claimed victory. And we know that God is the ultimate hero because ultimately the story of these heroes, of the judges, of ourselves, is that despite their successes, they're still human. And despite the greatness that Gideon was, he still fell prey and failed. But God empowered him for a moment at a time and called him to do something special. So we're going to continue by looking at more unlikely heroes as we go through this series. And today we're going to look at 1 Samuel 16 and the story of David. King David, not king yet. So let's catch up on a bigger story. If you want to turn to 1 Samuel 16, for me it's page 517. That will not be helpful for you. But 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, if you know where it's at. Big story. After this downward spiral of all of these judges. So if you've read the book of Judges, the judges were like Gideon. They're raised up because they're invaded, because they're being disciplined by God. God raises up a judge. There's repentance and victory, and then the Israelites mess up again, and they're invaded, and then a judge is raised up, and then they remember what they should be doing, and then they fail again, and then a judge is raised up because they're invaded. You with me? It's a cycle over and over. Israel decides that to get out of this cycle, what we really need is a king. We need a king. If we had a king like Mesopotamia, or if we had a king like, Egypt, if we had a king like any of these big other places, we would stop being invaded. And so God raises up this prophet Samuel to go find a king. And Samuel finds and chooses a man named Saul. Saul was a pretty obvious choice. He was tall, charismatic, good-looking, a great warrior. He was smart. No one was surprised that Saul was the one called up to be king. And everything starts out really good with Saul, but he turns out to be a king like most kings. He became proud. He used his position of power to serve himself rather than the people that he was called to lead, using and abusing the people and bending the laws of God to serve him however he felt like it would benefit him. And so God rejects him as king and tells Samuel to go look for a new king. And this is where we pick up in 1 Samuel 16 in verses 6 through 7. When they came to the house of Jesse, he looked over Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the heights of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on his heart. So Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, and have you seen Cinderella? Great. Get this image in your head. They go in and he has the glass slipper. And he says, I need to see all of your boys. Line them up. I need to see all of them. So Jesse brings out all of them except for one, this runty kid in the field. We'll get to him in a second. And Samuel starts seeing if the glass slipper is going to fit on one of these men to be called the next king. And so the first one, the oldest, Eliab, he looks tall. He's kingly looking. He's got a presence. Steel blue eyes, I imagine. If you want to picture him in your brain, I see Ryan Reynolds. Yeah, maybe Idris Elba. Who knows? Picture that stately, kingly. If you had to cast a king in your movie, picture them in your brain. There's Eliab. Sean Connery from the front row. Now, Samuel should have known better. God, hey, Samuel, don't you remember Saul, the tall, good-looking guy who looked like a king? You want to make that same mistake again? You're going to choose Eliab because he looks the part. I'm looking for something different. When God looks for leaders, he doesn't look at what we look at. He doesn't value what we typically value. He's not after the pretty face or the accolades. He says, I look at what's on the inside. I look at their heart. So a question to just wrestle here, not the point of the whole sermon, but just something that I think to chew on here. How are you spending time preparing your heart? We're going to get there in quite a ways. How are you spending time preparing your heart to be used by God? Sometimes we get so worked up and on what's going on the outside, we try to dress correctly, we try to say the right things. You think about all the things that you need to be doing to look like you're in the right part, but God takes that look on the inside. Are we foraging humility and compassion? Are we quick to forgive? Do we love? Samuel should have known this, but even the best prophets forget things from time to time, so God tells Samuel it's not going to be him. Next. Verses 8 through 13. Then Jesse called, long name, hard to pronounce, and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made the next son pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel says to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Then Samuel says, are these all your sons? And he said, well, there's the youngest, but behold, he's out keeping sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took a horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. It's kind of a dumb question, right? Are you sure you don't have any other kids? Any of you guys ever just like, how many do I have? 4? Maybe there's 5. My mom, there's 7 of us. Eric, Jennifer, whichever one of the 9 you are, right? There's this just silly. Do you have another son? Because I know the good one is here. Well, there's the youngest. He's out tending sheep. Like Jesse forgot about him. Like I left him out in the field. The words used to describe David here are not exactly pleasant in the original Hebrew. He's described as Catan. Ooh, everybody say that's a good one. Not the board game Catan. Catan. Go ahead. Catan. Ooh, and that's small and unimportant. Kind of a better way to think of it in this is that he was a runt. A wimpy, skinny kid. So my runty little kid is out watching sheep, the lowest job you could possibly do in Israel. You want to hang out with sheep all day and watch them? I send my little runty kid out there, and I give him a slingshot and be like, now if a lion comes, right? They gave him something to do, just to occupy him. This word also in there, he's described, some Bibles say ruddy, mine says ruddy. It's amoni. Ooh, that's a good word. So ruddy, a close translation is that he's red-headed, freckled, and pale. So we have a skinny, runty, wimpy, red-headed, freckled, pale kid out in the field with sheep. but he had pretty eyes. I love that that's thrown in there. He had pretty eyes. The point is, David absolutely looks nothing like who Israel thought their king would look like. He doesn't look like a man of war. He's not the oldest. He's not the strongest. He's a runty kid with a little baby face. When I was in high school, there was an artist that hit the scene on YouTube by the name of Justin Bieber. He doesn't look like a little runty kid anymore, but go back and listen to the song Baby on YouTube. You know exactly what it is that I think David looked like. This little runty, wimpy, blonde-haired, just little, blue-eyed baby face. And this is who God has anointed. David's strength didn't come from some inward awesomeness, some outward expression of his physical abilities. That's not why God chooses him. It's going to come from the Spirit of God. And in fact, if he's going to be able to be filled with the Spirit of God because he's not full of himself. He's not arrogant and big-headed. All he has to rest on is God's favor. Which brings us to the story that our young people on the screen told so well. We're going to go down to chapter 17, and we're going to walk through this story of David versus Goliath quickly and catch was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had a bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, "Up for battle. Am I not a Philistine? And are your servants not of Saul? Choose a man for this is my Goliath voice. Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man and we will fight together." When Saul and the Israelites heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly terrified. Whew. Okay, really quick. The Philistines. Short story. They're the bad guys. Great. They're a group of people still living in the land of Canaan that the Israelites have been failing to drive out. They're the bad guys. And the Philistines were a super, super advanced civilization for the time frame. So let's look at how we know that and take a peek at Goliath. How tall is Goliath? For bonus points, unless you're in my, not you two. Unless you're in my Old Testament Bible study where we just talked about David, if you know this one. Does anyone know what a cubit is? 18 inches. Do you know what the official length of a cubit is? Yes, bonus points. It's from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. You with me? So you wanted Goliath to measure your house for you because he's a big guy. And then the big one here, and it says he's also one measure, one length. And I just gave it to you. It's this. It's make the loser face, and it's the distance between your finger and your thumb. So Goliath is somewhere between 4 and 6 cubits in a measure. So he's like 6'10" to 13 feet tall. 13 feet. Somewhere in there. My picture of tiny David coming up to this, the average height of a fully grown male Hebrew at the time would be about 5'3". David is not exactly 20 yet. He's still a teenager. So we'll call him maybe 5 feet tall. I'm going to say it's the equivalent of Kevin Hart playing a pickup game of basketball against Shaquille O'Neal. Have you ever seen a picture of Kevin Hart standing next to Shaquille O'Neal? Google that. This guy is huge. Huge compared to these Israelites. Calling him 15 feet tall is what, if I stood next to Shaquille O'Neal, I'd be like, what is he, like 19 feet tall? A lot of there. Also, he's covered in armor, bronze helmet, he's got all this stuff on him. And it's so confusing to the Israelites that the Hebrew here is actually saying he's got thingamajigs on his legs. There's like a whatchamacallit over his shoulder, and he's got a what's-its thing as a spear, and it does this thing. The Hebrew is literally like a thingamajig. They don't even know what to call the stuff this guy has. But importantly, his spear is tipped with iron. Big deal. This is in the early onset of the Iron Age. So the Israelites have bronze weapons, mostly wood weaponry. And this guy has full armor, mail, and iron weaponry. This is a mismatch. This is a mismatch beyond belief. Kevin Hart v. Shaquille O'Neal in a basketball game, except Kevin Hart's not allowed to jump. This is this distance that we have between these two. So we continue on. Outmatched. 19 through 23. Now, Saul and the rest of the men of Israel were sitting there to fight, and they're fighting with the Philistines, getting ready to fight. David rose early one morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting out. He sends ruddy David out of the field with some cheese and crackers to feed his other sons because what else is he going to do? Because his brothers are all in the army. So he brings this snack to his 7 older brothers who are doing the fighting, right? Technically, they're not really fighting. They're just yelling insults at each other. So far, Goliath seems to be winning the insult game. So little David shows up there to bring those snacks. Continuing on, 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him and the great riches and will give him a daughter and make him his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What should be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away? For who is?" And the people answered him in the same way. "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." So David, as we know, gathers up and finally says, "You know what? I'll do it." My hero pose. I'll do it. So they try to fit him in the armor, and it's all too big because they're emphasizing how small he is. And he goes out with a few stones and a sling. And he faces Goliath and knocks him square between the eyeballs with a stone, and boom, down goes Goliath. Shaquille O'Neal loses a one-on-one against Kevin Hart. And he cuts off his head, and he goes back to the encampment. Here's the big question about this story that I love. What is the point of the story David versus Goliath? The bigger they are, the harder they fall. There's always hope for the underdog. Don't stop. Yes, there we go. How about if you trust God, God will give you victory over the giants in your life? Sounds like it could be a movie. Or maybe God has appointed you to conquer the giant of mediocrity and dominate in your workplace. I've heard these applications, but what is the main point of this story? What do you think? Take a second. This is the audience participation moment. Take 30 seconds here, and with somebody next to you, just think to yourself, what do you think the story of David versus Goliath, what is the main point of this story? Go ahead for 30 seconds and just talk to someone around, just see what we come up with. Here's the fun thing. This story of David isn't about you. It's not about how you can be the defeaters of Goliath. It's not about how great David was and how great of a champion that he would be. This story, by nature, is about how great God is. David was just a runty, scrawny shepherd who would go on to lead a nation. David was the overlooked and forgotten of Jesse's sons, but God gave Samuel the ability to see David as he would become with God behind him. David went on to lead thousands of people. God uses a completely normal shepherd to become one of the greatest kings. And here's why the story of David is so great. David learns all the things that would help make him a great leader while he was hanging out in a pasture with sheep. Because in the realm where the sheep are, in that pasture, David lived in obscurity. No one paid attention to him. No one thought great of him. He learned that humility in obscurity. In the monotony of the day-to-day life of the pasture, David learned. Hey, David, what did you do today? I watched sheep. They walked from there to there, and then they went from there to there 5 or 6 times. What else did you do? I threw some rocks. I had a slingshot. That was fun. Anything else? I was bored, so I picked up the harp a little bit. I was playing a few things. Wow, riveting stuff, David. He also learned reality. In the pasture, though no one paid attention to him, God, this master creator, infinitely powerful, intimately personal creator, was shaping David with a slingshot, with his harp. In the pasture, God developed David's courage. In the pasture, he learned patience and forgiveness. He learned humility. You can only think so highly of yourself when your main job is to clean up sheep poop. One of the secrets to David's success was he always seemed very aware where he came from and how much he relied on God. When God calls somebody, they are trained up in the pasture. You will have an encounter with God. Remember how important that is? You got to have a relationship with God, but you'd be equipped by God. We are equipped in the time of our pasture. We are equipped in our everyday lives. We are equipped in our time of obscurity, in our time of monotony, in the every single day-to-day of everything. There's a famous monk who wrote one time, if I'm going to sit here and peel potatoes, I might as well peel potatoes and let God form me in this way. When God calls someone, they are trained in their pasture. Hey, Mom, what'd you do today? I changed diapers. Did they appreciate it? Not really. My daughter kicks me when I try to change her diapers. Did she get up and tell you how blessed you are that it's your job? No. I changed diapers because I love my daughter. And that love stems from a love I've experienced with God. My motivation is there. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart for the Lord. Hey, teacher, what'd you do today? I taught kids long division. Did they appreciate that? No. I still don't appreciate it. Hey, business guy, what'd you do? I settled some accounts. Student, what'd you do? I studied some stuff about history and calculus that I probably will never, ever use. Obscurity and monotony. But the reality is, in your everyday, if your heart is set on God, you're experiencing God, and you have a relationship with God, you are being formed in ways to be used by God to be that unlikely hero, to keep the mission moving forward. David fails as an unlikely hero, just like Gideon. Gideon melted gold down and worshiped an idol. David, we know the story. He basically murders Uriah by sending him to the front line after he gets Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, pregnant to cover his shame. David ultimately would fail, but he knows where his heart lies and that God walks with him. God can use anyone, even in our own failures, if you're a person after God's heart. If you are being formed in a relationship with God in your time in the pasture, in the everyday monotony, and in the everyday obscurity. Let's pray.